All right, let's talk tariffs. So, what is a tariff? Simply put, it's a tax on imported goods. Think of it as a cover charge for foreign products trying to enter the domestic party. Governments might do this to make imported stuff more expensive, encouraging you to buy locally made goods, or to protect their own industries. Traditionally, in the US, the power to impose tariffs fell to Congress. It was designed to be slow, methodical, and ideally sensible. However, over time, the executive branch started to accumulate more power to enact tariffs, particularly under national security justifications. This magical phrase, often found in Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, allows the president to restrict imports if they are deemed a threat to the country's safety. This shift meant that one administration could suddenly decide to shake up global trade. And that, my friends, is where our story of transatlantic tariff tantrums really begins, with the European Union finding itself squarely in the crosshairs. Enter the Trump administration riding in on a wave of America First rhetoric. The solution? You guessed it, tariffs. Big, beautiful tariffs. The idea was to make foreign goods more expensive, thus encouraging American manufacturing. In early 2018, the announcement came. The US would impose significant tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. The European Union, a collection of some of America's oldest and closest allies, found itself very much on the list. The official justification for these tariffs on friendly nations like those in the EU, national security. The argument was that a robust domestic steel and aluminum industry is vital for national defence. This raised more than a few eyebrows. The European Union's reaction went through several stages, much like the Kubler-Ross model of grief, but for trade policy. First, there was disbelief. Surely they don't mean. Then came confusion, followed swiftly by annoyance, which then blossomed into outright anger. EU officials made it clear they viewed these tariffs as protectionist, illegal under World Trade Organization rules, and a serious blow to transatlantic relations. They weren't just going to sit there and take it. The tussle had well and truly begun, setting the stage for a protracted and messy dispute. The moment those tariffs on steel and aluminum were announced, the legal alarm bells started ringing. Can a US president really just declare that Canadian aluminum or Swedish steel is a threat to national security and slap on tariffs without a more rigorous, congressionally overseen process? This became the central question for a flurry of legal challenges. The challengers included American companies that relied on imported metals, industry groups, and even some states. Their core argument often revolved around the idea that the Trump administration had stretched the definition of national security beyond any reasonable interpretation. The journey through the courts, however, was anything but swift or straightforward. It opens the door to a world where trade policy is dictated by presidential whim rather than by established rules or congressional oversight. The stakes in this tariff tussle were enormous. For the United States, the tariffs on European steel and aluminum and the retaliatory tariffs the EU imposed meant billions of dollars were suddenly in play. American consumers and businesses faced higher prices for goods made with these metals. For the European Union, the financial implications were equally severe. Their steel and aluminum industries were directly hit by the US tariffs. Beyond the immediate impact, there was a crucial principle at stake. The EU couldn't be seen to simply roll over when a major trading partner unilaterally imposed what it considered illegal tariffs. Then there were the diplomatic stakes, which were arguably even higher than the financial ones. The Trump administration's approach effectively kneecapped the World Trade Organization, raising serious questions about the future of orderly global commerce. Section 5, he said, she said, quotes from the Transatlantic trade spat. President Trump himself was, as you might expect, rather vocal on the subject. He famously declared that trade wars are good and easy to win. This sentiment was often accompanied by tweets and rally pronouncements blaming the EU for unfair trade practices. Administration officials dutifully echoed this line. Wilbur Ross, then Commerce Secretary, frequently cited the national security rationale. Peter Navarro, a prominent trade advisor, often portrayed the EU and other trading partners as currency manipulators and intellectual property thieves. Across the Atlantic, EU officials struck a different, though equally firm tone. Jean-Claude Juncker, then President of the European Commission, responded with a mixture of dismay and defiance. He stated, "We will not negotiate with a gun to our head." Cecilia Malmström, the EU's Trade Commissioner, consistently argued that the US tariffs were illegal under WTO rules and pure protectionism. The whole situation was often tinged with a level of absurdity that was hard to ignore. The idea that luxury German sedans or Italian specialty steel posed a genuine threat to US national security was, to many observers, laughable. Yet these were the arguments being made with straight faces. The EU quickly compiled a list of American products that would face retaliatory tariffs if the US went ahead with its measures. This wasn't a random assortment of goods, it was a carefully curated selection designed to inflict maximum political discomfort in the United States. We're talking Harley-Davidson motorcycles, Kentucky bourbon, blue jeans, and agricultural goods like orange juice, cranberries, and peanut butter. The selection was strategic, often aiming at products from states politically important to the Trump administration. The EU's justification for these counter-tariffs was straightforward. If the US was going to ignore international trade rules, then the EU was entitled to respond in kind. Officials in Brussels were quick to point out that their retaliatory measures were fully compliant with WTO regulations. And so, the tariff tango escalated. What started with US duties on metals now saw EU duties on a range of American goods. Who ultimately pays the price for all this? It's businesses, workers and consumers on both sides of the Atlantic. It was a vivid demonstration that in trade wars there are rarely clear winners, mostly just varying degrees of losers. So, what were the potential futures for this transatlantic tariff drama? If the US tariffs were broadly upheld by courts or simply remained in place, it would have set a rather alarming precedent. Other nations might be tempted to follow suit, leading to a chaotic unraveling of the international trade order. Conversely, if the tariffs were struck down by US courts or reversed by a new administration, it would have been hailed as a victory for free trade advocates. However, even in this scenario, the damage to international relationships and business confidence might not be easily undone. Another possibility was negotiation and de-escalation. After the initial fireworks, both sides might realize that a full-blown trade war isn't good for anyone. The future of US-EU trade relations likely involves a process of careful, painstaking rebuilding. This whole tariff kerfuffle between the US and the EU wasn't just some private spat. Other major trading nations were watching with a mixture of alarm and trepidation. Countries like China saw the EU situation as another front in a broader American push to reshape global trade terms. Allies like Canada and Mexico were initially hit by the steel and aluminum tariffs too. Japan, South Korea and other nations heavily reliant on international trade worried that if the US could unilaterally impose tariffs on the EU, then no one was safe. It created an atmosphere of uncertainty and unpredictability which is pure poison for international commerce. The impact on global supply chains was particularly acute. The WTO's dispute settlement system was already under strain, and the Trump administration's approach further undermined its authority. It was a recipe for a more fragmented and potentially chaotic global trade environment. The Trump-era tariff tussle definitely put a strain on the US-EU relationship. Trust, a fragile commodity in international relations, was significantly eroded. The EU began to talk more seriously about strategic autonomy. However, despite the acrimony, the United States and the European Union are too deeply intertwined to stay truly estranged for long. The future of US-EU trade relations likely involves a process of careful, painstaking rebuilding. This means addressing the specific irritants one by one, preferably through negotiation. Subsequent administrations have taken steps to de-escalate some of these conflicts. the emphasis has shifted back towards finding solutions. Nevertheless, the genie of unilateral tariffs is now well and truly out of the bottle. Global market stability will heavily depend on whether major economic powers can fully recommit to a rules-based international order.